Okay, so texturing, we're back to the fun stuff. So this is when we're going to take all of our baked maps and our low poly meshes and texture them, make them look like they're supposed to, whether it's metals, wood, all that good stuff. There's a few things to do in preparation. I've actually already done one thing, which is to name these materials the texture paths inside these BGSM files so that when we do export the textures into our texture folder, they will pick up the textures and use them, basically. If we look in the materials tab at the texture paths, these textures don't actually exist yet, but when we export, hunting revolver reflex underscore diffuse, N for normal, S for specular, when these three textures turn up in the folder, this material will pick them up and they're already applied to the NIF. This material is already applied to the mesh in the NIF, so it'll just work. The materials will correctly apply when the textures land in the textures folder. So that's done. Another thing I want to do is, let's just go into wireframe mode here. I finished all the collision, as you can see. And what I want to do is I'll just isolate the receiver and basically take all of the meshes and parent them underneath, so all of the relevant meshes that are actual parts, and parent them underneath the hunting revolver parent mesh, so that these meshes won't get moved around by all the bones anymore. They'll only get moved around. I mean, they'll all stay in, relative to the receiver itself. They won't move basically because they're no longer under the influence of the bones. Yeah, the bones will just float out here and do whatever they want to do when the vanilla animation loads in game. And I'm primarily doing this so that when we load the game, we can view the weapon. Obviously, it won't move, the hammer won't move, and the cylinder won't move or anything, but the gun will be basically intact, and the meshes won't be flying around all over the place. What I could do is take the speed loader out, so that in game that shows up behind, some distance behind, or maybe to the side of the weapon, so I can check the textures on that. This is purely a preview thing, so I'm going to export that. Hit G and then go to receiver. I might name it differently. I'll call it preview here, just so we can keep the old one. Oh dear. I was hoping this wouldn't happen. Let's try and save a scene. And let me check my export, so it didn't export. Damn, blast! Alright, let me give that another go. One helpful thing 3DS does do is when you save a recovery file, or at least attempt to, it will have the recovery file in the most recent files. So yeah, makes the whole situation a little less painful, but not by very much. Okay, let's try this again. And I believe it's actually deleted the NIF because it was corrupt or something. Oh, no, it's there. My mistake. But it does sometimes happen if I can't remember where, but... Ah, man. Alright, I'm going to have to troubleshoot this. Right, so I basically brute forced it. I attached all the movable meshes together into just one unified mesh and then exported it, and it seemed to work fine, no crashes. So let's check the export. Oh yeah, I haven't converted it yet. Check the rawness. So yeah, that should work fine. And I'll use Elric off screen to convert the mesh for use. So let's go to our mesh folder, and we're going to rename this to, let's say, custom anims ready, so that we know that this is the one with all the bones in the correct places, ready for animation, and this is our sort of temporary preview mesh, which we're going to use to preview the mesh in game. Okay, so Substance Painter, let's dive right in. We're going to go with Metal Rough is what I like to texture in. And we're going to choose, so what I should do is, these are all the FBX files, the combined files which I exported before. In fact, what I might do is, let's take this speed loader and pop it quite far back away from the mesh. You'll see why I've done this later, so we can rotate around the model and texture it more easily. So, overwrite the old FBX, and then we can import the new one. Let's go with a 2K map. Normal map is fine, DirectX, that's what it should be. And now we can add the texture files which we want to use. So let's go to the receiver and the Marmabake folder, and then we can bring in these two textures, the AO and the normal, and we can use these two to bake all of the other maps which we want to use, as I explained before in the baking part of the tutorial. Okay, so we have the mesh in. I hold shift and right click and we can rotate the light, the scene light. What I'll do is I'll just click here and select the normal map, which is obviously the purple one, and then the ambient occlusion map, and everything looks good. Perfect. Now we'll click Bake Mesh Maps. I'm going to hit None and choose 2K. Hit None to deselect all of the meshes so that we're not rebaking the normal and stuff like that. So we're going to bake world space, curvature, and position. And I believe the rest of these settings are fine. So I'm just going to hit Bake. Now see it says Bake Combined, and obviously that's the green material which we were using in 3ds Max. So we're going to rename this now, before I forget later, which I've done before. Hunting Revolver Receiver. And now when this exports, it'll put a suffix on the end. The diffuse will have _D, _N for the normal, and the specular will have _S. And then those textures will convert directly into the texture folder, and as you can probably imagine, the BGSMs will then pick up the naming correctly. Let's save our scene. And I like to save inside the meshes the folder of the particular mesh which we're doing. So let's do, I just like to end it in SPP for Substance Painter project. So we now have all of the maps baked. So we have the curvature and the position, and if we hit B, then we can preview each of the maps. World space normal, this is one of my favorites. I just like the colours, I think, and the softness, which you can see very well in your normal. ID, we haven't baked an ID map. An ID map is basically it marks each different shell or object. There's different ways to do it, but the gist of it is it gives each part of the mesh a different color. So one might be purple, red, yellow, or you can mark multiple objects. So you could say, oh, this part of the body should be yellow, the speed loader should be red, and then you can mask it out by using a color ID mask and say metal should only be on the parts which have an ID of a yellow color, and it'll just automatically select the yellow part. So it's really quick and easy and convenient. But because the whole mesh is basically metal, we don't really need to do that. So if it be again, we have the AO, the ambient occlusion, which we baked in Marmoset. And now this is the curvature, which Painter baked based on or rather converted the maps which we already had into this. And the white edges, curvature is basically a grayscale map which indicates where there's the severe curves on the model. It can cause some, well, you just need to be wary of cylinders on the model. So this is fine here because this is not a tight enough cylinder to cause curvature type problems, and it's here as well as fine. But if we take a look at the yoke spoke, then we have this very white color because of the curvature is basically the size of the curvature is causing this type of bake to happen in the curvature map. Yeah, it's hard to describe exactly why this is happening because I don't know the intricate details. Here we can sort of see there's a sort of faceting going on in the bake, and this is I need to take a look at that. I still haven't taken a look at that. I need to figure out what's going on there. But we do have some faceting inside the cylinder because of probably the sides which the model baked with. But that's the ambient occlusion map. So yeah, there's like small shadows in each of the sides. I think I used a 100 side or maybe a 50 side cylinder for this, so it might not have been enough, but it's subtle enough to probably not be an issue when it comes to the texturing. Then we have the position map, which is a measurement of the position of the mesh in space. So down here we have more of a lower color, seems to be purple. Further back color more bluish, and the top is more greenish, and front more yellowish, it seems like. But obviously you don't need to know all that. It's basically just if you want to add dirt to the lower part of the model, this is a good map to indicate where you want that to happen and things like that. And then we have a thickness map. I never really use thickness. I think I can live without it. And then we're back to normal. So yeah, if I hit M, then I can return to material view, and we can preview the mesh as it's being rendered as a material. What I will be doing is cycling between, if I hit C, I can cycle between my main maps, and then if I hit M, I can go back to the main material. So I'm going to be doing that a lot as I cycle through all the different maps. So let's take a look at the Smart Materials folder. It does take a bit of a while to load, at least for me, because I've got so many presets in. You can sort of collect Smart Materials over time from Gumroad and maybe ArtStation, though generally ArtStation usually links to Gumroad. But there's the sort of Smart Material packs which you can search up and either get them for free or purchase them. There's some pretty good ones out there. But what a material is, it's basically a single. Actually, you know what? Let's step back a bit because I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. Kind of jumping into using the materials before I've gone over how you actually use the program itself. So Substance Painter is, well, it's pretty magical. It's like a 3D version of Photoshop. So you have your layers, at least if you have the same layout as me, you have your layers over here. You have your brush paint tools here, your texture set list, which is basically how many materials the mesh has. So if this mesh had more than one material, or if you've imported multiple, say you imported the standard barrel and the scope in as well, which I don't recommend because it'll slow down the file and bloat the file size a bit and make loading it a bit slower, but you can if you want. But if you had multiple materials in the scene, then they'd all stack up under here, and you can do certain things like soloing the material if you want to isolate one mesh. But I like to do it part by part and just import the same materials into the other scenes. So I'm going to texture this, save the materials up, and then basically apply them in the other scenes, which saves a lot of time. That's another benefit of Substance Painter with its Smart Materials system. So down here we have the shelf, which lets us choose all the sort of different resources which we want to use. So we've got alphas, which you can basically use for your brush to mask it in a certain way or stamp on labels or details onto the mesh. So we might be using these at some point. Again, this is a lot more than you would get in the regular Substance Painter. I've picked up some big alpha packs. Above that we have project, which just basically shows everything we've imported into the project. In this case, the marmoset textures and the textures which were baked inside Painter based on those. Grunges, these are really good for masking. Again, I'll get into that later. Procedurals, I don't really visit this tab very often, but again we have editable patterns and stuff like that, which is good. Textures, again, don't really visit this very often, but it looks like there's some... Yeah, so this is basically all the textures in the project, plus any textures which are in the textures folder in your shelf, in your, my documents and stuff. I don't really use these other 3 here, so we'll just skip past them. Oh well, I guess filters, you can apply these to layers to edit them, like, blur it, or apply a hue, saturation, lightness to control what hue, saturation and lightness you want for the for the material, and yeah, various other things, which, yeah, you kind of have to use these to figure out what they do. Brushes, this one gets lots of use. There's all kinds of different brushes here, so you can sort of paint onto the model. Particles, this is an interesting one. It does get some use. These you can use these. I may or may not show these, but they let you sort of spray onto the model and get a certain effect. Yeah, again, I might show them later. Tools, these are very specific, and you probably won't have the ones that I do, but again, they're quite situational. And then we have materials. So these are basically a single. So if we drag one into the layers, then we instantly get an effect on the model of this bare metal. Now this is just basically a single material object. We can control. This is where we control all of the parameters of the object. So we can, for example, toggle the roughness off so that it doesn't affect the specular highlight of the model, or we can turn the color off so it doesn't affect the color. If I go into the base color, oh yeah, so if I hit C, I go forwards in the maps. If I hold shift and hit C, I go backwards. Just a useful tip that I somehow forgot myself. But yeah, you see there's no color information here, but there's lots of other things you can customize in here. We have scratches, so if we want to reduce, I think you can remove all the scratches. You can control the depth, so you can make them very stark, very deep in the model, or not. So some materials may come with these controls. Yeah, dirt intensity, you can see it collecting here. This is due to both the AO map, ambient occlusion, and the curvature map, which is very good for depositing dirt in places that make sense. So this is the strength of Substance Painter, is the use of all these additional maps to generate detail where it makes sense, and do a lot of the legwork for you, so you can you spend most of your energy polishing the textures rather than doing menial layer copying and repeating stuff. But don't laze out, okay? Don't get lazy. It might seem like it's a magic program that just generates amazing textures for you, but the truth is you can get a good result very fast. You can get 80% of the work done very fast, but the last 20% does take a while. It takes even longer than the first 80% to really polish it and really make it stand out. So where was I? Yeah, these are the editable parameters which you sometimes get in materials, but not always. And these are the image inputs, so it's currently reading our ambient occlusion and our curvature map, as I said, in order to generate certain details like this dirt and perhaps some other stuff, like maybe there's some edge wear in here, but I can't really. Yeah, so there's some like lightness on the edges there. We can delete this layer and yeah, might as well delete the example material. So that's what a material is. It's basically a single object which does sometimes have parameters. The difference is smart materials are more like folders which hold multiple materials inside them. So if I go for, I think I've got a steel, spell it right. Let's try this one. Now this is coming as a folder, and it has multiple elements. So if I go to the roughness layer, which controls the sort of shininess of the model, so the more white the texture is, the rougher it is, whereas the more black, the shinier it is. So you can see that these scratches here are blacker and therefore shinier So when the light casts across, it's kind of hard to see, but the scratches will basically show up and pick up the light more. Well, it's kind of easier to see there. They'll pick up the light more based on their roughness information. So if I turn off the roughness details, what we get is a basically completely flat roughness response, specular response on the model. So smart materials are a good way to sort of throw in a more detailed material in one go, but it's also a good way to create your own materials and propagate them and share them between your own projects. Okay, so we might as well get cracking. I kind of already have by throwing this material in. The Magnum BFR is actually made of stainless steel, but as it is in Fallout, that's kind of boring. And even after, say, a few hundred years, yeah, the stainless steel might have corroded a bit. Well, dirt might have collected in the crevices, but stainless steel doesn't corrode, so it'd be kind of a boring texture. So instead I'm going to go for there's an artist I know called Millennia who did a retexture of the hunting revolver for Fallout New Vegas, and he put a darker metal on it, which was a corrodable material, and allows you to throw a lot more colours in, and rust and dirt and all that good stuff to make a really interesting texture. So yeah, compromising. I might look into doing a stainless steel texture just as an option, because it would be quite simple, I imagine. But for now, let's go with the route which I think would be a better idea, which is to make the revolver more interesting by changing the material, by changing its material despite the fact that the real world counterpart or its inspiration doesn't actually have that material. So yeah, there's no real quick way to do this. I didn't really plan very far ahead for this tutorial. There's a lot of trial and error in texturing, I find. It is something that you kind of have to get in the flow of. Dark steel aged, that sounds good. So I kind of like how this material is at least starting out. I can feel that it's sort of the right direction. But let's say I don't like how this edge response is being handled. Let's open the folder, take a look at the scratches. So this is a fill layer. Let's just close these triplanar settings. I realise I didn't talk about layers, so let's hide this for now. We have up here basically several different options for putting textures into the scene, materials that we want to use. So if we click the add a layer button, all the layer is basically an empty layer, like you would have in Photoshop. I actually very, very rarely ever use these empty layers. Instead I use a fill layer, which basically fills the entire layer, as it sounds, with information that you want. So you can set a base color here, however, whatever color you want. You have a height, which is sort of, it impacts the normal. So I'll go into this later, for example, when I stamp the bullets. We have roughness, and you can see the more white the roughness map is, the more matte and unresponsive specular the material gets, whereas the inverse is extremely shiny, and you probably never see this amount of shininess in the real world apart from perhaps chrome. There are certain called PBR accurate values, but as we're working with Fallout 4, it uses a sort of specular smooth system with Cubemaps that isn't really a close PBR approximation. So we're going to be, well, winging it, for lack of a better term. But our results will still look good in Engine. So sort of go with what you think looks good, and then that usually ends up looking good when it's converted into the engine with the correct settings, of course. So that's roughness. Metallic is usually either 0 or 1. At least that's what all the PBR documentation says. It should be either an absolute non-metal or an absolute 1, which is a metal. Rust, generally when you bring in a rust material that someone else has made, it's somewhere in between because it's a bit dubious, but yeah, it should be either a non-metal or a metal, and when you use the materials they'll be marked as either 0 or 1. So a metallic map, conventionally when you look at a metallic map on its own, if I change the view type by hitting F1, F2 or F3, we can see that the metallic map should be either if I actually go to the metallic layer, then it should be either black or white conventionally. So M, F2, and then we have the normal, which, yeah, it's just basically a flat normal, like we created in Photoshop for the blockout phase. This doesn't affect much, and I've never really edited the colour in here because that would do some weird stuff to the model, probably shading wise. So what else do we have? We have effects. So these, a generator is one of the features of Painter, which is, again, as I mentioned, very strong. So we simply add a generator and we can choose what kind we want. So let's say go with metal edge wear. Yeah, so we don't actually want to add that to the layer itself. We want to add it to a mask. So I'm kind of jumping around a bit here. There's so many features to cover. But if I right click and add either a white or black mask, so a white mask isn't going to do anything because, like in Photoshop, it's completely white. If I alt click the mask, white means the material will appear. Whereas if I remove the mask and have a black mask, then that means the material is hidden. So if I click on the mask and go to material view and start painting with a white color, you'll see that the material comes through because white is where the material is allowed to go, black is where it isn't. I'm probably overstating this. I'm probably going over this way too elaborately, but that's essentially what a mask is, and you probably know it from Photoshop, is that, you know, white means appear, black means not. My English is getting worse and worse the more I explain this, so let's move on. So yeah, we have the mask here, and now to the mask I'm going to apply the generator of the metal edge wear. Okay, so looks kind of ugly, but this is purely for example purposes. What's happened is the generator has interacted with the mask and has generated a grayscale result, which allows us to control where, as I've alt-clicked on the map, where we want this material to actually appear. So I think what I'll actually do to make this a bit more, I'll remove this mask, have this as a base material, and then I'm going to alter the color of this upper mask, and then up the roughness, lower the roughness to make it shiny, and increase the roughness on the metal. So then we instantly get a sort of matte metal, but with worn away edges sort of effect. So let's take another look at the generator, now that we have what looks like more of a metal. And the generator gives us a lot of options. So obviously we have wear level, which controls how drastically we want to build up the effect of the wear on the mesh. You can see here that the rounded part, because it's looking at the curvature, if I go to the curvature, the rounded parts of the mesh will build up wear much more rapidly than the flat parts. As you can see here, we increase the slider and the hemisphere and the cylinder get a lot more wear than the flat parts do. Contrast is, as it sounds, it contrasts the masks. If we go for a really low contrast, then that's very tolerant of the mask. If I go into mask view, you can see all the small details. We basically get all of the details of the mask. As if I increase the contrast, it's like applying a levels in Photoshop. The generator becomes very sharp. And this is actually quite a good effect for metals. You do want the contrast to be at a certain level to get that convincing. Because if the edgeware, I found this in the past, if the edgeware is very soft, it doesn't quite read as metal always. So you do want a certain level of contrast on the wear. So what is triplanar? The default method to apply a material, gonna try and shoot for a, wow, that's interesting. Gonna try and shoot for a, it's taking a while to drag out as well. Or is it even? No, there we go. Gonna shoot for a more complicated material to apply. One with a pattern. Let's see what we have here. So we have, this might be a height, yeah, slight height, but mostly roughness and stuff. So this is applying a certain wood mask that's then controlled in different ways. So first we have a warp, which strongly warps the pattern. This is a filter, so someone's clicked here and then clicked filter and then searched for the warp filter and added it. Then we have a levels to up the contrast and clamp out the color, the grayscale. Looks like a slight blur. That's almost unnoticeable actually. And then an anchor, we don't need to worry about that. So this is currently a UV projection. If we go into the UV view, we can see that the pattern continues along. Maybe if I reduce the warp, then it'll be more obvious what's happening. But it's basically pasting the texture across the UV like an image, as you'd imagine. So this is a fill that's using the wood 01 grayscale map to basically fill the texture space with this one texture. And that's UV projection. Oh yeah, we also have scale. So it's kind of hard to see. Maybe if I turn off all these effects again, might be easier. But yeah, you can see this is the tiling basically. Yeah, let's lock. Okay, so that was unlocked. Now that we've locked it, you can sort of see what's happening. The texture tiles when it's outside, and this dotted square, I'm not sure how well you can see that, represents the original texture. So it's tiling off in this direction, and the scale scales the texture so that we can either have, you know, a very large and unique result or a very repetitive, which is often okay, as long as provided you apply all these additional effects to it. You can't quite tell that the pattern is repeating, largely due to this warp, which makes it unique. So that's UV projection. It applies the texture just flat onto the UV. So in contrast, triplanar projection essentially projects the texture in several different directions onto the mesh. So if we move this texture across, it's quite slow because there's lots of processing going on. I might turn this effect off actually. We can see that the projection is happening as if it's being projected onto the sides of the model in different directions. So we can see here the image is being projected in this direction from the back, from the side, and from the bottom. And this causes some artifacts, like here you can see the bottom projection and the side projection are interfering with each other. So it's not the best for very continuous surfaces where you might see the pattern or the projection interfering with each other. This can be somewhat rectified by using the hardness slider. This controls the blending. So if you go for maximum hardness, you can really see the seam where the different projections are being separated, the bottom and the side and the back. You can see here actually on the hemisphere, the back's coming in from this direction, the top, side, you can really see the separation. Whereas if we reduce the hardness entirely, that makes it much less noticeable to see those seams. So that's the difference between UV projection and triplanar. UV projection just projects it directly onto the UV, and triplanar projects it basically in 3D space onto the different surfaces of the from different directions onto the model. Okay, so hopefully that wasn't too confusing. Back to our generator. Where was I? Okay, so that's triplanar. So we can toggle this on, and that usually, a bit of lag there, but that usually makes the texture a bit more unique, I hazard to say. It creates a different effect. So now that you understand what's going on, you understand what's actually happening with the projection. Generally, you need to reduce the scaling, which we'll actually do soon. So I'll leave projection off for now. So grunge is the sort of particulate, at least in this case, is driving off the curvature. Just an autosave there, and it basically fills in the empty space in between the edges. So it's a good way to add some visual interest to these flat areas, as well as break up the rounded areas and actually have some restored wear there, it looks like, so it's not quite so boring. Okay, then we have grunge scale. This controls the pattern of the grunge, so it's just like what we looked at with the Damascus steel. The UV there was scaled in a certain patterned way that you could either have it very low and low definition, or increase the scale but have it repeat more, have high detail but have it repeat more. So yeah, this is a good way. I usually go with 2, just seems to be a good level of scale for what works for me usually, but again, you want to experiment with these things. What's left? Use custom grunge. I think I don't use this that often. I can't remember exactly how it works, so if you really want to know how it works, then it's good to do some experimentation. I think you drop a grunge that you want to use in here, so it might be good for getting some different effects that aren't just the usual. Edge smoothness. Now this affects the curvature map, and makes the edges I just keep repeating what the settings actually say. Edge smoothness, it makes the edges more smooth. Yeah, no kidding. So the curvature map is deciding what the edges, where the wear should be. But if you want to have the wear spread out more, you'd increase the smoothness, and that adds more softness to the mask. We can actually preview the mask and take a look at what that's doing. So you can see the edges smoothing out. So ambient occlusion masking, it masks based on occlusion. Surprise, surprise. So we have here an area where there's quite heavy ambient occlusion. We go to the AO. Yep, we can see that there's a shadow there. So if we reduce the masking, then it's going to ignore the ambient occlusion. Whereas if we increase the masking, then you see some blackness start to appear there, because that's where the ambient occlusion is coming from. So this is good for if you want to make scratches make sense. So it's unlikely that something would get into this small crevice and actually scratch the surface here. It'd be quite strange. If we completely turn off masking, then the chances of something often getting into this groove here and scratching it up is unlikely. So it's good for that. And then finally we have curvature weight, and this is again a curvature specific parameter which lets us control how much influence the curvature has over the generators. Honestly, I think I'm over explaining this stuff. You can figure it out yourself just by messing with these sliders and previewing the mask, but hopefully that was a good summary of what these things do. Okay, so what if we don't like a very specific part of the mask and we want to adjust it? Say I don't like where there's, so this area is too scratched for my tastes. So what I can do is add a paint mask, and this allows me, think of it like in 3ds Max, like you add an edit poly modifier onto the top of your stack. This lets you edit the texture. If I go into the brushes and choose, classic dirt brush, why not? This lets you make edits to the texture so that you can adjust the parts that you want. And it saves it in this paint file layer effect. I guess that's what they're all collectively called, effects. So this lets you make edits and save it into a layer so that you don't have to make destructive changes, which is good because you can adjust the rest of the generator settings and it'll never really interact with the paint file. If you want to remove the changes that you've done, it's not really right to go in with a white brush. Instead you should go to the eraser and simply erase the paint layer. This won't affect the other material, obviously, the fill layer which you've done. It'll only erase whatever changes you've done in the paint effect. Okay, what else is there to cover? Might as well show me adding a filter. Let's just go for hue, saturation, lightness. Well, to be honest, this would be better to edit the actual color layer, the actual material itself with. So if we go to filter and add hue, saturation, lightness, we can then directly control the lightness, the hue and the saturation of the material, but because it's a grayscale material, that's not really going to have much of an effect. What we could do is blur, let's say, the edge wear, so that has an obvious effect. Looks like a PS2 texture or something. So these are very sort of utility based type things which you can use for very specific purposes. But the ones that I use the most, I'd say, are hue, saturation, lightness, levels. Oh, levels is a different effect. I'll get into that in a second. Maybe blur. That's pretty much it. These are different finishes which you can apply to a material which result in a different roughness or specular response. We might as well move on to levels. So this is as it sounds. You can control how, it's another method to control the contrast or the output of a layer. So if you don't want it to be completely black, you can clamp the blackness, or similarly clamp the whiteness if you don't want it to be completely white. And this gives you control over the black and white levels of the scene. So color selection, this is if you had baked an ID map, you'd be able to choose what colors you want to mask out with this. And anchor point, that is quite complicated. I don't really want to go into this, probably because I can't remember exactly how to explain it clearly enough. I'd probably be stumbling through it. But this lets you control, for example, edge wear around material, say stamps which you've stamped into the texture yourself. dynamically inside Painter. So usually you'd stamp details on, like cartridge or serial numbers, into the metal itself. Then you would save out that normal map, re-import it into Painter, and use it as a new curvature map. Whereas this anchor system lets you bypass all that, and when you mark a detail as being anchored to, as having an anchor point, then the curvature can then reference it and adjust what it's doing with its generators. So yeah, a bit complicated. I might actually use it later, because I will be stamping certain things onto the mesh. But yeah, I've already gone on long enough, and this is just basically a primer to Painter, so you can kind of get an idea for how long it takes to, well, it doesn't take that long to get a very fast result like this, but it does take a while to really refine the texture and get what you want in the end. So I think I'll cut the recording here and get into texturing, and then show you the end result when I've got something I'm happy with. One more thing I thought I'd mention: if you rebake your textures, say in Marmoset, or make changes to the FBX, let's say I wanted to take the casings out, which I actually do, so let's do that. Let's remove, or actually let's move it to the side, so that they're separate, and maybe even the cylinder out, just so I can see what's happening with it. Or maybe actually, let's put it above. I can select this, export it, and then all I need to do is go to project configuration, double click the updated FBX, hit OK. So preserve stroke positions would be, if we painted onto the mesh, then it would remember what we did and reapply it to the mesh once we've re-imported it. The rest of this isn't, I never really tinker with it. Okay, so there's the new mesh, and we have, or rather the updated mesh, and we have all of the parts in the new place. So I can see what's going on much more easily, especially with the bullets. I could barely see them at all before. So what if we rebaked the Marmoset files and we want to bring them in anew? All we need to do is, where am I? Right. Go to the bake location, select the, in this case, PSDs, drag them into our shelf, and then I'm going to click and control click to have them both selected as textures. Import into, so we can either import them into the project, which we will do because we only want them for this project, or you can put them into the shelf, which will be saved to the shelf, and you can use them for any project. You'll be able to access them in the textures folder of the shelf for any project. So just going to import them into just this project. Now we need to drag to update the normal and the AO, and then we'll need to bake and rebake these textures. And that's what you need to do every time you update the mesh, so try not to make mistakes, or at least scout out for mistakes. For example, this one here, which I think I'll go and fix now, that you need to adjust or fix for the mesh before you go into all this business. So make sure you fully execute each step, and you've made sure that you have everything correct before you move on. But you can go back in the process and update things and edit things if you so wish. Okay, so I went ahead and reached the stage at which I felt was the first iteration of the work in progress texture. So let's dive in and take a look at what I've done. Oh yeah, there was one thing which I forgot to mention last time, which was the display settings and the environment map. This is panorama by default. If we up the opacity, this is generally what the cube map, the HDRI type thing that most people will be using by default when they start a new scene. But we can actually change this to a more clinical. If I lower the blur, it should be clearer what's going on. But this map usually adds a lot of sort of tints to the model, like blues and greens. Good to get an idea of what the gun might look like out in the world. But if we go to Tomoko Studio, that's a much more clinical environment, which doesn't bias the look of the model so much. Oh, we do actually want to just hide the environment, and then we just get a very pure preview of what we're doing with the model. So yeah, I exploded the pieces out a bit more. The yoke is out here now, and I think I separated the bullets as well, but again, just to get a better view of what's going on. Alright, let's take a look at the layers. So I've added a folder here containing all of the fill layers and masks and everything which constitute the base metal of the weapon, the texture which we're creating. So let's hide from the top and see what we've got. Okay. So yeah, just start with a steel base. All it seems to have is, yeah, a base height, just so that we have an actual base to start with. Because if you don't have a height base, I think it actually defaults to 0 anyway. But yeah, anyway, the base material should have all of the parameters in, I think. So yeah, we have just a grey colour to create the base metal colour. Let me hide those bolts, they're a bit distracting. Yeah, we got a roughness of 0.3, quite shiny. At least in game it ends up being quite shiny, and you get a lot of the Cubemap influence. Full metallic, of course, and just a blank normal. Next we got the darker steel. So I did highlight some of the parts, of the gun to be a darker steel, just because I think two-tone rather than all the same type of material is a bit boring. I mean, two-tone instead of all the same material is more exciting. So, you know, if the gun has two tones of colour, then it's nicer to look at because you've got a bit more variation going on. And next we actually have discoloration, which adds a lot of various colours to the gun. So I don't think of metal as being just, you know, grey. I mean, there's oils and dirt and all kinds of stuff. So at this point, I've actually been playing Fallout 76. It only came out a few days ago, and I used the single action army in the game, and saw that I quite like the sort of oily pattern they had, especially noticeable on the back of the hemisphere, whatever this part is called, that covers the cylinder. So I kind of got inspired by that design and tried to use a bit of a toned down version of that. If I go back to the material view, then you can see that's the effect. And then I added roughness variation. So this is purely, selecting the wrong layer again. This is purely a roughness. So I've toggled everything else off and just had roughness and maxed it to, well, to full roughness, which is full white, and then used a mask which consists of two fills. So I went to add fill, and then I dragged in a grunge here, and then I balanced it out with the contrast as well, and then added another fill, and this time I set it to sub and made it triplanar. So if I move the mask, you can kind of see what's going on here. It's, yeah, removing the other texture and adding a bit more variation, because if it was just this, you'd be able to see some of the patterns quite easily. Whereas if I add a sub, that adds a lot more variation, a lot more interest to the roughness response. Next up, if I go to the roughness layer, we have scratches, and these are very non-rough. In fact, they're maxed out on the non-rough scratches, so that they really pick up the specular when the light passes across the surface, as you'd expect. I usually don't colour my scratches, but I might add a sort of subtle scratches later, which do actually have colour in them. Ah yeah, one thing. If we go to the roughness control, then we're able to see that there's a slider here. So what I've done is, I usually max out my roughness either one way or the other. If I'm adding shiny things like grease or scratches, then I max it out on this end, and if I'm adding rougher things like, I don't know, dirt, then I max it out on this end, and then I'm able to control the influence of the effect via this slider here. Just let it save. So what that allows me to do is actually preview. So this layer is disabled, this layer is on 82% influence, this is on 38. I'm able to just preview rather than having to go into the material and actually look at the specific roughness color. I can just alter the influence, max the roughness, and alter the influence, and it's the same for other things like that. Now this is a painted roughness variation. Let me just see where I've actually applied it. Oh, no way yet. But yeah, usually if I have a painted mask, then I've added a paint to it, then I say painted. And the reason for this, I name it painted so it's easy to see. The reason why I do this is because when you import it into another project, the paint will be different because the paint layers are unique to that mesh. You've painted, you know, here and you know, there, but when you import it into, say, a barrel, which is a completely different shape, it'll try and paint in the same areas, but of course it won't be able to. It'll be a completely different mesh, and it'll probably look really weird because, you know, you didn't intend for that to happen. So when I have these painted layers, when you import them into a new project, you usually delete the previous paint and add a new one so that you're ready to recreate the effect that you wanted to. So essentially this is a unique painted effect which only applies to what you're doing right now usually. So we have some soft edgeware, and I used metal edgeware. Looks like so there's the curvature map. Go to curvature. The curvature has a sort of grey color over these flat surfaces, and I didn't like the effect that was having. Go back to material. I didn't like the effect that was having on the mask because it was lightening this surface, so I simply just painted it away with a sort of grungy brush, and then used levels to sort of take it back just a bit. And that is a color and a roughness fill. So we get oh, I might, yeah, okay. I've disabled the roughness. I'm not even sure why I'm even having roughness then, but yeah, it's primarily a base color fill, which just adds a sort of highlight to the edge purely in the color. And then we have edgeware, which is a more grungy and sharp result, and that does have roughness on it, which really picks up the edges. Now the reason I'm being so heavy-handed with the roughness here, if I was texturing for anything other than Fallout 4, then I'd probably take back this roughness just a bit to make it a bit less harsh, you know, so that you didn't get such a massive response. Because again, you wouldn't get this absolute shininess unless it was chrome and completely clean. So you generally want to avoid that unless you're working in Fallout 4, in which case you can really ramp up the roughness and try and go for a less subtle approach. Because once you convert the textures and go through that whole process and everything, generally in game the textures aren't quite as subtle as you see them in here. And I mean, even in Marmoset, it's a completely different effect. So for every different renderer, every different game you import your textures into, it's a different mindset. You kind of have to figure out the environment and do different things for what you want the end result to be. You know, you start here and then you have to try and translate it into the game or engine of your choice. And then the last two are just sort of crevice dirt. So again, this is a painted layer. So I've got a paint effect here, which I've augmented the dirt generator with. So it started out as this, and then I painted and edited it to end up like this. Probably still need a few more touch-ups. For example, here there is some dirt which I don't necessarily want because there's bullets going in and out of this, you know, all the time, so the dirt would probably be brushed out. So I'm going to select the paint layer and then hit 4, which will bring me to this selection mode, and then select the UV fill and select the black color, which will mask it, and then just click and remove the dirt from these shells, and maybe this teeth as well. Maybe I'll leave that there because that's a bit interesting. But yeah, that will remove the dirt from what I want using the paint layer. Okay, and then we have a more, let me hit 1 to go back to paint mode, and we have a more general surface dirt which just finishes off the roughness as well as the base color. So it adds quite a subtle effect to the base color. That's another thing, the base color is really quite vivid in game. You don't want to be too contrasty, too colorful with the base color, because in game it really does stand out. We'll go to roughness. Then yeah, you can see it does have quite a subtle effect on the roughness. I should maybe make it a bit more obvious. Yeah, that really completes the base material, which I've done so far. Let me move on to additional details, and the reason why these are in a separate folder is so that I can right-click this folder and create a smart material and bring that into other things such as the barrel, without needing to use without needing to use any of these effects, because these aren't going to go onto the barrel. The serial number isn't going to be there, and the roughness fix, which is specifically for the bolts, isn't going to be used. So these additional details are purely for use in this receiver file, and this folder I'll be importing into the other mods. Okay, so let's take a look at what those additional details actually are. So first up, I've got gunpowder residue, which adds roughness and base color to certain aspects of the gun. So I've actually added it on the front and back of the cylinder, which adds a sort of yeah, a bit more character to the gun. It's been fired, it's been used. I can maybe dial back the base color just a bit, and maybe the roughness as well. But yeah, then we got the serial number, which yeah, I did check the wiki to get this exact number, but this is the same serial number that was on the base of the gun in New Vegas. And what I did was I re-imported the normal. Go to combine normal. Then you can see that so this is a height map, and I imported, so I used the text alpha and I stamped in the mask onto the bottom of the gun, and then I exported just the normal map and then re-imported it. Let's see, is it this one? This one. Re-imported it, and it already had the number here as though we baked it in Marmoset. Then I went to Bake Textures, Bake Mesh Maps, and rebaked. The key one is the curvature, which then created the effect for the text. So created a height layer, stamped in the text, exported the normal, re-imported the normal, reprocessed the curvature, which then created this effect, which allows the stuff like the edge wear to apply to this because it's now part of the normal map. So yeah, that's how I did that. And then we got the bolt roughness fix. So often with very round elements like this, they do end up being overly shiny. Well, not in this case because I painted dirt over them, but you can see there sort of the shininess really coming through because the element is so round. If we were to remove the dirt, then you'd see these are they're almost like chrome. They're so shiny because of their roundness. So to fix that, I created a fill layer purely to fix the the roughness. But I think I might have increased the roughness to counteract the dirt. Let me see. Yeah, so I think I adjusted it to counteract the dirt, which might have got me back to square one, but hey ho. You can have these fill layers to fix that kind of thing quite easily. Just a useful thing to have. Then finally we have the bullets, which are in their own separate folder. So the folder for the bullets is purely selecting, so I hit 4 and went to element select, and then I was able to, you know, highlight the bullets, purely the bullets, so that we're only working with the bullets in this layer. And then I added a pure brass material and simply a copper dented material and masked it to just the bullet heads. So this is just a very simple step 1 for this part. I wanted to get into the main frame before I spent any real time on the bullets. But right, okay, so we have our texture, and we obviously want to test it in game. One thing before I mention what I'll just mention what I did. So here we have the old receiver, which, well, the receiver which we're going to use in the future, which is compatible with custom animations. Nothing's changed here. What I did do was copy the entire receiver again into a temporary receiver, which is merged mesh-wise, so in-game it won't pop and explode or anything. It'll just be one cohesive mesh. It won't animate, of course, but we'll be able to preview stuff like the bullets and the speed loader outside of the gun, as well as the gun as just one hole, without it doing weird things. Okay, export. So I'm going to hit the export shortcut, which is Control-Shift-E, and this will be the defaults for you. So you want to set this to Targa, and go up here and make sure you set the output path as the SP Textures folder for your selected part. In our case, it's the receiver. So I'll select that folder. It's going to export here. What I've done is I've created a preset. I've got various presets, but this is the main one I use almost all the time, Fallout 4 Diffuse. And so this is the setup. So to start, this prefix, the naming means that it'll use this name down here as a prefix for the texture. So this will come out as hunting revolver receiver _D, because we've told it to through this sort of keyword. I'm not exactly sure what it's called, but if you put this in, then it'll use this name. So we've got 3 maps coming out of this. We've got the diffuse, the normal, and the specular, or smooth spec as it's called in Fallout 4. And the first, so we're converting all of the maps. Basically, when you export textures from Substance Painter, you drag in the outputs from here. So if you were to export the diffuse as is, you drag this here. But in our case, I think we're exporting. I think we're texturing with either base color or diffuse. But anyway, yeah, I always just convert to diffuse. Then we've got normal DirectX, of course, just dragged in here. And so this is the weird one. This is the smooth specular. The blue channel is not used. The red is for specular, and the green is for glossiness. So again, we've just dragged in here and set these channels as their particular outputs. So yeah, copy this setup and you'll get the exact same result that I do. So I'll hit export and open the folder and see what we get. So let's take a look at the diffuse. So first off, you'll see that these metallic parts are extremely black. Now this is normal for a metallic roughness workflow. That's just how PBR is, and what we This is actually what we don't want. So if we were to import this into the game, which I will do in a second, the metals will be extremely dark. So we'll have a way to rectify that in a second. Let's open the next texture. So we've got the normal. We can see the letters have come in now. And this is the combined normal. Any height information which we might have painted onto the mesh come out as a combined map like this. And then we've got the specular, which is green most of the time. The vanilla textures are greeny red. But yeah, again, the blue map is blank. Oh yeah, so when you send these through Elric, they'll actually turn blue because the blue channel just inverts, and then your preview is of a blue texture, whereas the exports from Painter are blank maps are left black, so you get a green color. But yeah, this is the specular channel. Out of Substance Painter, it is quite uncontrasty, so what you might want to do is actually add a layers, create a separate PSD that you can import these exported textures into, create a layers purely for the red channel, and then actually clamp the red channel so that it's a lot more contrasted, like that, and you get a lot more pop in the game. But I will avoid doing that for now. And then the green channel, which is of course glossiness. So you can see that the scratches are very white now. So glossiness is the inverse of roughness. So if this was a roughness map, then these scratches would actually be black because they're very not rough. Yeah, talking about game art really brings out the poor grammar in you. But yeah, these are white because glossiness. I mean, it's in the name. Roughness, more white is more rough. Glossiness, more white is more glossy. It's as simple as that. So we won't save our changes. Okay, so what do we do to rectify this black metal syndrome? I think what I'll actually do is I'll bring in Elric and I'll convert the textures. I've got Creation Kit open, and all I've done is I've copied in the path for the textures for the hunting revolver. So I've pasted that in. So any files that I convert will go directly into the game files in the textures weapons hunting revolver folder as a DDS. So we'll convert the files and we'll choose all three. And as you can see, as each file is converted, it comes in. And here's what we have, which is a pretty good start. But the metal is darker than we'd expect it to be, because I've made mine a bit lighter, slightly, than it's darker than New Vegas, but lighter than my original inspiration, which was Millennia's hunting revolver, because I feel like if it's too dark, then it might conflict with the Sequoia's distinct look, because the Sequoia is a very, very dark gun. The metal on it is treated in such a way that it's extremely dark. So yeah, I just wanted to differentiate the hunting revolver from the Sequoia. Okay, so how do we fix this? So the reason why the metals are so black is because when Substance Painter exports with metal rough converted, it thinks that metals should be black, which is correct. But what we're going to do to fix that is actually make the metals not as metallic, which is kind of heresy in the world of PBR. But to make it work in whatever you want to, it's you have to do what you have to do. So let's create a new layer, set it to the metallic mode, and go with a pass-through, and we'll call this FO4 adjustment. We'll just put it in a folder actually. Control G. Now I do have to remember how to do this because I usually just drag it in from the I made this preset ages ago and I usually just drag it in. But yeah, so we're going to go to levels, metallic. Okay, this isn't working how I remembered it, so let's just drag in the the Fallout 4 adjustments material which I've made before. Again, I am sort of doing this tutorial on the fly without really rehearsing it beforehand, because that would just take so long. So apologies, but yeah, we can see, yeah, okay, so the reason why is because I didn't have the folder on pass-through mode as well. So we're in metallic mode, and we need both of the folder and the layer to be in pass-through mode. The folder is in case I add any other adjustments I want to do, in case of, you know, if I want to make the wood less rough or the metal more shiny, then I can do that. But for currently we just have this one layer. So we add a levels, in fact I might as well do it again. So we have our folder, it's set to pass through. We add a layer inside the folder, set that to pass through as well. Then we add a levels, go to metallic, and then we clamp the top of the metallic to 0.8. So this will ensure that the level of the metallic will not go above 0.8. So you can see that the whiteness is brought down there a bit. And what this will do is Substance Painter will think that the metals are a little bit plastic, a little bit non-metal in the export. So it won't export the metal as dark as usual. So let's export again. And we can instantly see in the thumbnail that the diffuse is a lot lighter than it used to be, especially the metals. And here you can see they're not completely black anymore. We can actually see that oily colour which I included. So let's open Elric, have Creation Kit open in the background, and then we'll convert. We don't need to convert the normal again, so I'm just going to select these two, diffuse and specular. And there we go, the metal's lighter, the roughness isn't quite so drastic. And we have a pretty good starting material with the necessary adjustments for use in Fallout 4. So I think I'd just like to end with some general philosophy about texturing and sort of what to look out for, what you should be thinking about. So let's toggle off the adjustments layer for a bit. So there's a certain texturing philosophy which it goes by various names. I think it goes by layer cake, big, medium, small shapes. I like to call it big, medium, small shapes because that's straight to the point. But when you're texturing, there's certain elements of the texture which you want to sort of layer in a kind of hierarchy. So if we're talking about big, medium, small, then the big aspect would be the overall base metal, which would be this grayness, which we have here. The medium shapes would probably be the edge wear, and the small shapes would be the dirt and these smaller scratches. So if, for example, my medium shapes were not sufficient, let's remove the edge wear, then we have, it doesn't quite look right because we have just the large shapes and just the small shapes, so we have lots of tiny details here, and we also have the large detail of the overall texture, but there's something a bit missing. We don't quite have that medium, something in between. We do sort of have slightly larger shapes here which fill in the medium aspect, but as soon as we add the edge wear back, then we can see that it just adds that much more to the texture. It's kind of a poor example because these shapes are kind of based on size on the texture itself. So what I might actually want to do is add, say, another paint layer, brushes, just pick something real quick and dirty, and actually add. So if I hold Control and left click and slide left to right, then I get flow level. If I move the mouse up and down, I get rotate. If I right click, then I get size. And if I right click and move up and down, then I actually get hardness. So if you hold control, there's various different, if you hold control and don't move the mouse, you get the controls to the left, which is a good guide. So if I add larger wear here, and maybe along here, I'm just kind of randomly picking out areas which it could maybe do with, and here. Then, in fact, let's turn the adjustments on. Because the roughness is so harsh, it's kind of hard to see. But now I've added the medium shape of this roughness here. So we have the small elements, like this small dirt around the bolts, the large elements, like the overall metal color, and these medium elements, which are larger and have a sort of middling effect on the texture. So yeah, these texturing theories are sort of hard to describe. But that's one of the things I think about, is big, medium and small shapes when I'm texturing, and all balanced. So if you have tons of tiny details and no medium, then you probably want to think about adding slightly larger effects. Again, it's all based on the size of the mesh and what kind of surfaces you're working with, and things like that. Another one is to think about how the gun is being used. So I might have a scratchy brush and actually, scratch along the side of the hammer. I know this looks terrible, just ignore it. Along the side of the hammer, because the hammer, is pulled out all the time to fire the gun. So I'll probably have scratches along the side. Stuff like down here, there'll probably be more wear around the trigger guard, because the thumb is constantly coming down. It's probably more on this side. The finger is constantly rubbing up against this edge of the metal to reach the trigger, and it's the same along this back of the grip. The hand is constantly brushing up against the edges. If the gun hits the ground, then that the edges are being hit of this grip probably, and all the extraneous sort of poking out parts of the gun are probably going to be more vulnerable to dings. What else? So there's contrast in general. You always want to go for contrast. This is a very, very vague idea again, but contrast creates visual interest. So the lightness of the metal edgeware pops out against the darkness of the base metal, and that creates a nice contrast. If we look at the roughness, there's areas of contrast and areas of, well, yeah, it's all contrast, isn't it? there's areas of lightness and areas of darkness, and they work together to create an overall effect. So yeah, I know this is a basic theory, but I thought I'd mention it. Just something to really think about if you're a beginner to texturing. And I think the last concept I'll cover is areas of rest. So you never want full detail all over the texture, absolutely everywhere, because as the name of the theory suggests, there's nowhere for the eye to actually rest, and you've just got I know I'm ruining my texture right now, but I've saved, so it's fine. You've just got constant detail everywhere, and there's nowhere for the eye to really settle upon. The inverse of the area of rest is the focal point. So you want the eye to be attracted to, I think I'll just reload my file actually. You want the eye to be attracted towards certain elements and rest and not have as much detail in other areas. So again, this is another thing. Like contrast, it creates visual interest, and it's then enjoyable for the eye to sort of peruse your texture and settle upon areas of interest. And again, the the areas of rest direct the eye towards the focal point. So yeah, that's the last theory I think I'll cover. So let's take a look at the bullets. This is something I just remembered to mention. The bullets look very drab compared to the substance painter bullets, and the reason for this is Fallout 4 uses tinted Cubemaps for different metals, whereas Substance Painter has a true PBR renderer. So in this case, we need to actually apply a tinted brass Cubemap to the casings and a tinted copper Cubemap to the bullet heads to get the desired effect, because right now they kind of look sort of plasticky, and we don't want that. So yeah, that just about covers texturing. Hopefully I wasn't too vague, too arty-farty, as they call it. It is very hard to teach texturing. You kind of have to really put in the hours, experiment. It is probably the most artistic part of the process. So you really have to figure out your own voice when it comes to texturing, and what you prefer to do. So yeah, I think I'll cover those Cubemaps next. Right, so for these tinted Cubemaps, the first thing I've done is to separate the casings and the bullets out and just parented them underneath the weapon entry so that they're a separate mesh, because that's what we need to do to apply a different material to them compared to the receiver. Okay, so next we need to create alternatives of the receiver metal, because the bullets are on the receiver material. Sorry. So let's go with receiver brass and receiver copper. Okay, then we'll go to our materials folder and create alternatives. I'll just underscore copper and brass, and then actually apply. So that was copper. This is brass. Okay, and then we apply. Casings is brass. Bullets is copper. We'll export. Bring in Elric. Convert. And I'll find my convert meshes folder and just drop in the newly assigned bullets and casings with the material. So what we've created so far, all of these three materials are currently identical. So we need to apply a different Cubemap to these two. So what I've done is I've exported all of the Cubemaps in the game. If you go to your data folder, textures, weapons, no, textures shared, Cubemaps, then you've got your Cubemaps here. So these are all the vanilla Cubemaps. I used Bethesda Archive Extractor to export them, purely so I can select them and actually get the path to them to paste into the BGSM. So let's take the I don't think there is actually a brass Cubemap. So we'll take the bronze one because it's the nearest. Copy as path, paste it into here, just like we did with NIF scope earlier. And then we'll go to the brass, paste in here, so we don't need the textures on the front. Shared, default outside. So by default, we go to our receiver texture. Again, almost all textures and almost all materials in the game use this default outside Cubemap. Let's find the copper. Copy as path. So just shared. And then paste. Okay, so that should just work now. But we have created new materials, so I'll probably get purple bullets, in which case I'll need to restart CK. So I'll just hit OK because we've already got everything selected, and then wait for the CK to reload. Okay, our keyword's in already, so we'll double click. Close and preview, and there we go. The metals look a lot more vivid now, and they look a lot more like their intended metal, both the brass and the copper. Of course I'll need to add a white cap here, because that's just what the bullets look like, and that cap will be slightly tinted brass because of the Cubemap, but it's fine. The overall effect is much better now. So yeah, that's how you do Cubemaps, and apply a different Cubemap. You separate the mesh and apply a material with a different Cubemap than the regular default outside Cubemap. But after that you might want a slightly different effect. I maybe do, so I'll probably cover custom Cubemaps after this. Right, custom Cubemaps. So it's been a while since I've done this, so I might be a little rusty. But we'll start with our Cubemap. So let's drag the default outside Cubemap into Photoshop, and it gives us the layers of basically the different directions of the Cubemap: up, down, left, right, forwards, back. So this is like the basic untinted version of the game's Cubemap. So let's save into our, for now we'll save it into just this, our textures folder, as a working document, and call it maybe custom brass. Okay, so what I'll do is I'm going to add a hue saturation to the Cubemap and try and get a sort of brassy colour. I won't take too long because for the sake of time, let's just say that. Now I'll copy the hue saturation onto each layer, because we're going to collapse these down so that they actually apply to the layer. So I'll select the top layer and just hit Ctrl E, and that collapses it onto there. We can see that the next layer down, well, all the layers below are being affected by the top adjustment layer, but as soon as we collapse one, then it stops working on the ones below. So we need one for each layer, basically. So yeah, now every single direction is tinted. Next, we'll hit Ctrl-Shift-S, and we'll save with the Intel TextureWorks plugin as custom brass uncompressed, in caps because that's clearer. And I'm going to choose this preset which I've saved, but basically we're exporting color plus alpha. Oh wait, no, that's wrong. Cubemap. So we're exporting Cubemap from layers with no compression. So let's take a look inside our hunting revolver. So here's what we've got. It's blue because it's uncompressed. Now we need to convert it into a usable Cubemap texture. So we're going to use a program called Compressionator. And we'll open the image file which we want to use and save it. Save image as. Get rid of all these ridiculous suffixes. And save it as, yeah, what I just did, that. So yeah, now we have our usable Cubemap, and all we need to do is go to our material which we want to use it with. Replace our old bronze with our new, oh, it looks like I took the entire entire path there. Get rid of the comma on the end. And yeah, have the path in. Go into Creation Kit, memorize this color. It might change, it might not, depending on the changes I made. But yeah, slightly different. But the point is you can customize it and have it in tune with your textures in Substance Painter exactly how you like. You don't have to be confined to vanilla Cubemaps, which is nice.